if folks who are too zoomed out today to come and join us can watch it later. Let's see.
All right, so we are live on YouTube and it's recording. So if you guys want to watch any of this later, you can. Hi, thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Rachel. I'm a librarian at Lincoln Library. Thank you. This is Dr. Brandon Derman to do Struggles for Climate Justice. And happy Earth Day, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is in partnership with the National Endowment of the Arts, Big Read 2021. With LabGrow by Hope Yarin. So we've been doing a lot of science and nature themed programs, and thank you for doing such an important topic and such a relevant topic for us tonight. Without further ado, take it away, Brandon.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for being here. Looking forward to sharing some information here. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my book from last year called Struggles for Climate Justice, Uneven Geographies and the Politics of Connection. But I'm also, frankly, a little bit more concerned to try to get you to think more about climate justice and also about some of the ways that you might engage with this topic in this issue area in town, even here next week. So here's what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk first about climate injustice. I know one or two of you on the Zoom can explain some of these factors themselves. But I'm going to spend some time on that, and that's going to be the main bulk probably of what we talk about. And then I'm going to walk through the different chapters essentially in the book where I talk about some different efforts for climate justice, right, to respond to the problems of climate injustice. And then I'm going to take you through a couple opportunities that you might want to take advantage of next week. All right, so let's just get in there, and I'm going to move myself out of the way so I can see this slide. Right, so as you might have noticed in the subtitle of this book, the idea of the uneven geographies and the politics of connection. Why are we thinking about the politics of connection? Well, if you know any organizers who work in the area of climate justice, and some of you might, then you probably already know that it's all about connections and drawing connections that allow stakeholders to see themselves as implicated in producing or experiencing climate change and the uneven impacts of climate change. And this is the piece that's a kind of more academic piece of the text. I'm also interested in thinking in terms of connections, or what I call relational domains in the book. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the more theory side of it today. You can read about it, or we can talk about it if you want to. But just briefly, this idea of thinking in terms of connections or relational domains does a bit of work that I think is really important. For one thing, it helps us to understand how climate injustice works. Why should we be concerned with climate justice? Why is that a political stake, maybe a legal stake, maybe a policy stake? Second, it helps us to understand how the climate justice movement was built and is being built, because it is continuing to be built. And this work of connection and the politics of connection is, I would argue, a key piece of how it's being built. And then finally, if we're thinking about the kind of outcomes of mobilization and the growing salience of climate change and climate justice, and we're interested in what does a policy actually look like that's going to address climate change and maybe deal with at least some of the dimensions of injustice or inequity that are connected with climate change, well then this idea of thinking relationally also helps us figure out how to address some of those inequities, because arguably they are key to the overall problem or crisis of climate change. So I'm interested in 3 of these relational domains, or these kind of types of connection in particular. And the first is nature society. The second is social groups and spaces. And the third is stakeholders and decisions. And we'll circle back to think about some of these later on and kind of ground some of these ideas in terms as we go. But what I want to do before that is jump right in and start to think about, what do we mean when we talk about climate injustice? We wouldn't have or need a climate justice movement per se without a problem of climate injustice. So you might be used to thinking of climate change as global, as we kind of come up doing global climate change, global warming. It is global, but it's also spatially uneven. And you might be fascinated with some of the processes of climate change and the outcomes from climate processes. How are those linked with actual events on the ground? There's a ton of interesting work, particularly in attribution studies, that look at that in the scientific lens. And in a lot of ways, climate change is unprecedented. We see that all the time on the news. But on the other hand, at the same time, there's a lot of aspects of climate change impacts that are troublingly familiar. And those are some of the aspects that are wrapped up in the idea of climate injustice. So just first, what I'm going to walk you through here is some of the cuts on this idea of climate change being spatially uneven, or these uneven geographies, as I call them in the subtitle and in various moments in the book. So here, what you're seeing on the screen is just a map of temperature change, right? This comes from the National Snow and Ice Data Center. That's part of NOAA. And as the caption says, this image shows trends in mean surface air temperature over the period of 1960 to 2011. So this is all in the past. So these are observations, right? Data that was collected, not projections, which are the other main category of climate change data and sources of images that you might see around climate change. So notice that the Arctic is red. What does that mean? Well, of course, it means it's warming faster than other parts of the globe. That indicates that the trend over this 50-year period is for an increase in air temperature of more than 2 degrees centigrade, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, across much of the Arctic, which is larger than that for other parts of the globe. And the inset there shows a linear trend over the period by latitude. They probably can't really see that part of it, but the main piece here is just to say, hey, yes, global climate change indeed, but spatially uneven around the globe. Now, if we want to walk some of those impacts that are connected with this kind of first level variable, temperature and precipitation are typically the first variables you'll see there, the most widely reported and widely monitored variables associated with climate change. But those, of course, trickle through the Earth's systems and then the social systems that are tied to the Earth's systems. And so that's one of the ways in which I propose we need to start thinking about the uneven geographies of climate change. So if we think about this image, for example, and hopefully you can see some of the kind of fine modeling in this image. What we're looking at, this is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. What we're looking at here is change in maximum catch potential. This is fish catch potential in the period 2051 to 2060 compared to 2001 to 2010. Okay, and then we have a little abbreviation, which I'll touch on in a second there. So here, we're encountering a comparison between some projected outcomes, right, some predictions, and some measured variables in the past, right? And we're seeing a comparison about what's going to happen, we think, according to this scenario that's called SRES A1B. And I've added this little caption here. This is just a mid to low emission scenario. So in other words, it's probably not where we're going to end up unless we start taking some pretty drastic actions. But the point here is the incredible variability in change in fish catch potential around the globe in this period of time, right? So global, yes, but what is it like to be a fisherman up here in Norway, for example, versus down in Bangladesh, right? Where we're looking at a loss of 50% of fish catch potential versus a rise in 100% of fish catch potential. And obviously, when we catch fish, it's to eat them, right? Or to sell them. So by implication here, we're seeing changes in temperature in the atmosphere, affecting the change in the sea surface temperature and down into the water column. That's affecting where fish are and how big they are. Those are the two factors that underlie this graph or this map in the IPCC. And that's going to impact what humans are doing on the surface in villages near those fish, right? So I want to walk through some of the connections between those variables and how they begin to impact what I'm going to call Earth systems, right? So the biological factors like where fish want to be, how big they can grow, etc. I want to connect those up with the social setting of life for humans on Earth in human communities that might be, in large respects, rather removed from those physical realities of how big the fish are and where they are, right? So here is probably my favorite diagram from the IPCC. And this whole diagram is about explaining the idea of risk. If you're familiar with the literature around climate change, climate impacts, then these are the words that you may have seen before. Things like hazards, vulnerability, exposure, and risk. So I sometimes joke to my students that I plan to get a tattoo of this image at some point because it captures so much of the world in which I live as a scholar and teacher, right? So when we think about risk from climate change, risk of bad stuff happening, maybe good stuff happening, but anyway, massive change that's going to impact people. Obviously, on one side, we've got climate impacts. There's natural variability in the climate. That's real. There's also anthropogenic climate change. In other words, climate change made by humans. That's also real. But on this side of the diagram, we've got, I lost my mouse. There it is. We've got all these climate variables happening, like the temperature changes that are happening faster in the Arctic. On this side of the diagram, though, we've got all those things that impact what life is already like in that fishing village in Norway or in that fishing village in Bangladesh or wherever else you might be. And these are the socioeconomic processes or conditions in places in human communities. Those have to do with socioeconomic pathways. They have to do with adaptation and mitigation actions. And so those are the policy responses and the implementation of policies that are meant to address climate change. And then they have to do with overall factors of governance, which is frankly kind of a bit of a black box, kind of a vague term in this diagram. But the real point here is that socioeconomic processes impact vulnerability. How vulnerable are people to the hazards that result from climate change and from anthropogenic climate change and the way that's adding to natural variability in unprecedented ways to produce risk, right? So I'm going to show you some maps because I'm trained as a geographer and we like to look at maps. So hopefully you like to look at maps too. This is going to be a series of maps. This type of map is called a cartogram. A cartogram you may have seen before are kind of bubbly maps that distort when you take the regular area of a spatial object or a country, a state, something you could map on the ground, and you distort that area by some other variable, some non-spatial variable. So this first map is just to kind of wet your palate and see what the Earth looks like in this particular projection. So this is kind of normal, quote unquote. Right now, we're just looking at area of countries in the world. So we're going to deform those to look at some of the aspects of responsibility and vulnerability for anthropogenic climate change. So first, one measure of vulnerability to anthropogenic, well, to any climate change, right, is poverty. So I'm going to read straight from the caption here. So country sizes, or it's really region sizes in this map, show the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day, $1.25. Poverty adds to climate change vulnerability because lack of access to health services increases the risks of climate changes. And lack of access to capital makes it harder to implement adaptation measures. So you could think of that happening at really a variety of scales. You as an individual, maybe your household, maybe your community, maybe your state or country, etc. It's pretty straightforward to surmise that poverty is going to impact our ability to adapt to changes in the environment resulting from climate change. So what we're seeing here is these areas of these different regions of the globe just simply multiplied by a factor that captures the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. So that's in the vulnerability category, the stuff that makes your risk higher, right, to climate change. But let's switch over to one of the aspects of responsibility. So when we think about responsibility for anthropogenic climate change, again, we're thinking about emissions. Okay, we can problematize that to some degree, but what I'm going to show you here is responsibility in terms of historical emissions. And I'll read again the caption. So country sizes here show CO2 emissions from energy uses 1850 to 2007. Why 1850? Well, roughly the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when we started to really dig up the coal and burn it as quickly as we thought we needed to and could, frankly, to develop in certain regions of the globe first, and then shifting into oil and natural gas, et cetera, other climate changing greenhouse gases. So these are, again, historical emissions. So this is a cool map. Maybe I'll post the link that you can access. You can look at different measures of responsibility. I like to look at the measure of historical responsibility, and a lot of climate justice organizers and activists also do. Why? That's because these historical or cumulative emissions remain in the atmosphere for centuries. That's a bit of a simplification for the use of this particular graph. A lot of times people use the proxy of 100 years or 1 century. So the point is, though, I drive to campus in my car, I'm burning some fuel as I do so. Those emissions are staying there, having an effect over approximately a century on the globe. Europe and the US dominate in this map, obviously, having released about half the CO2 ever emitted. One of the reasons that I chose to show historical emissions per se as a measure of responsibility is because it's so clear when we toggle back and forth between these two cartograms how disproportionate responsibility and vulnerability are with respect to anthropogenic climate change. So this, arguably, as a nutshell, is one of the best ways of capturing the idea of climate injustice. Although, of course, there are a lot more subtleties that we could get into. And so we'll touch on a few of those as we go along. Here's one for the real map heads out there. And this is a map produced by a friend of mine. His name is Luke Bergman. He's a geographer at UBC, University of British Columbia. This is from an article he did a little while back. What we're looking at here is a map of the globe. We're looking straight down from the Arctic Circle or the North Pole. Santa Claus is somewhere right there. But what Luke is trying to show us in this map, the reason that he chose that view is to see the ties between places. When we see a map like this, or we see a map like this, we're not always aware of the way in which these different parts of the globe are connected. They're connected in a lot of ways. You're used to thinking about that if you're used to thinking about commodity chains, for example. One of the classic questions to teach geography with is, where did your breakfast come from? What are the processes, who's involved, and what are the places involved in that breakfast? Well, here's one partial answer to those kinds of questions. So in this map, Luke is mapping, and this is based on a kind of massive matrix. That's called an input and output matrix for economies of at the national scale. So he's looking here at, in 2004, which countries emitted the carbon through greenhouse gas emissions that we've been talking about to satisfy the consumers in which other countries, right? So perhaps an awkward phrasing, but I think you get the idea. If I'm over here in central Illinois, where the arrows happen to be nearly pointing, and I go to the Walmart and buy the thing made in China, yes, the emissions to make that thing came from China, and they're on the ledger for China's emissions for the year. But arguably, I bear some responsibility for it because I'm the consumer whose need or desire is being satisfied by those emissions. But Luke, who's got a major brain on him, went even further. And here's another image that I want to show you that he produced. So this is, where did the capital accumulation, which you could call profits, in other words, or the economic growth, occur for those carbon emissions? So again, what we're seeing here is a way of pinning down responsibility that's somewhat more complex than simply looking at historical emissions, because we're looking at the processes that those emissions are embedded in that knit different places and people together. So we've been looking at images at the global scale, at things like countries, and even at sometimes coarser at regional scale, right? But it's important to recognize that these kinds of inequalities and vulnerability and responsibility, they also pertain within countries, even within communities, right? So just as one quick sketch of that, here's an image from an Oxfam report from 2009. So it's already kind of aging, but what my point with this one is really just to look at another way of more finely slicing in spatial terms social vulnerability. So I don't know if you can read that because it's a little bit gray, but what we're looking at here is a matrix of colors, and the matrix captures social vulnerability through things like poverty, and it also captures hazards related, in this case, to flooding. So these are counties. This map is made from counties. So this kind of purplish level here, that's where you've got the highest level of social vulnerability coincident with the highest level of hazard, right? So clearly these vulnerabilities, which contribute to risk, and the hazards that also contribute to risk, if you remember my tattoo, those are spatially variegated even at a scale down to the county level, right? And it's important to remember that we can only map what we have the data for, right? So there's always variability that we're not capturing in a map like this, going down typically to finer spatial scales. So the point here then is that over time and space, greenhouse gas emissions have been disproportionately emitted, and the impacts of climate change are disproportionately affecting people. That's true within places, and that's true between places. And this is the factor, this is kind of my last cut on the idea of climate injustice to leave you with today. So groups are affected disproportionately at many scales, including within cities and communities. Which groups are disproportionately affected? Well, here's the part that's probably not going to surprise you, because as we've started to kind of surmise, I think, from some of these maps, emissions basically have been correlated with social power that's gone along with development throughout human history. So poorer people, people of color, Black Americans in particular, indigenous people all around the world, women, the very old and the young. And you could probably add to this list when you do your own research on disproportionate impacts of climate change and climate changing emissions. So this is the kind of inequality that we're talking about, the kind of disproportionate impact that we're talking about when we talk about climate injustice. So just to quickly pin that back to these three different relational registers that I talked about before. And again, this is the kind of more theoretical piece of the book. This is the more conceptual piece. I think it's interesting, but then I'm kind of a nerd, and this is what I went to school to learn about, right? So we can think about the ways in which these connections, these relational registers in the nature society category, for instance, affect climate injustice. And one of the subtexts here that I want you to think about is, what is the relationship between climate injustice, as I'm calling it, and climate change? How connected are those? Arguably, they're quite intimately connected. So greenhouse gas emissions from economic development, obviously that's contributing to the climate change problem. That's one of these nature society ties. But also the socialization of that climate change and the environmental impact that has in different places, remember the fish catch and things like that, those impact on socioeconomic processes in different places differently, right? So environmental effects are re-socialized, we could say, the reverse of the nature society connection. And then we've got social and spatial forms of connection that are also wrapped up in the production of what I'm calling climate injustice. We've got historical and contemporary relations of power and inequality that are clearly connected with maps like those we've been looking at, maps like this one. Right? And we also then have these relationships both within and between polities. Polities just being a term for a governmental unit, a spatial unit that is governed independently. And then finally, we've got stakeholders and decisions, or what I tend to call governmental connections or governmental relations. We've got political access, influence, and representation. All those things are going to matter as we go forward thinking about climate injustice, its production, and also climate justice, the attempt to resolve some of these injustices. So that's that first section for you. So in the book, that's really the first chapter. It's kind of a meaty chapter. If I had to rewrite it, I might do it somewhat differently. But that's the take home that I think is most crucial, especially for Americans, in terms of climate change and climate injustice. What I want to do then now is talk a little bit about some of the ways in which different organizations and individuals, and in some cases institutions around the world, have tried to deal with these injustices or these inequities. And so what I do in the book is I have a chapter on a few different case studies. And I'm going to trot through some of those. If we get short of time, I might abbreviate a little bit. But the first section looks at international laws and institutions. And so I want to spend a little time with those, because you might be thinking, well, when we've got problems of this nature, right, we have some institutions that are at least ostensibly designed to help us deal with them. And you're right. So let's look at a few examples of these. So the chapter after that kind of meaty and difficult to digest one on climate injustice looks at early legal mobilization for climate justice using human rights, the arguments that bring international law norms to bear on this problem that is arguably one of injustice, right? And so I look at two different kind of legal documents in there, and one of them is a petition that was brought by the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which is a group of Inuit communities, so those indigenous peoples that live around the Arctic Circle, and they brought it within a forum called the InterAmerican Commission on Human Rights to seek relief from the impacts of climate change on their communities. And they charged the United States with violations of their human rights through global warming. So that is an example of using some of the analysis that brings together law, brings together culture, and brings together science to make a case about responsibility existing through nature-society connections and across spaces, and using this mechanism of a petition brought before this human rights body, a regional human rights body, because it's on the Inter-American, it's in the Western Hemisphere, to try to mobilize those stakeholder decision maker connections, right, to make a case for climate justice. The other case that I talk about in that chapter has to do with the Maldives, this island nation. It's actually more than one island, but it's an island nation in the Indian Ocean. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that one today, but you can look it up. It's got some similar connections that are being made in those claims. So I'm going to dig in for a moment here to some of the text in the ICC petition. Okay, so what are they arguing, and how are they putting together an argument that is relational, that brings together nature and society, that brings together Inuit communities and factories and users of engines all around the United States to make this argument? Well, one of the things that they do is to trade on the notion of culture, to lean on the notion of culture, which is recognized in the Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man, which is what it was called, coming from the early 1940s, which is one of the founding documents of this human rights body, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. But they do this in a creative and innovative way, bringing together the idea of land, the idea of culture, and a whole set of science findings to make a human rights claim. And so as they write, generations, young and old, meet on the land. This is a peek into Inuit culture. The wisdom of the land and the process of the hunt teaches young Inuit to be patient, courageous, tenacious, bold under pressure, reflective to withstand stress, to focus and carry out a plan to achieve a goal. So what they're describing there is a sense of what Inuit culture values and the ways in which traditional knowledge serves a primary purpose in perpetuating that culture, but also the way in which that culture is wrapped up in livelihood, wrapped up in getting a living literally from the land. But as they note in the second part of this quote here, the land that they're referring to when they're speaking of living on the land, the old teaching the young to live on the land in all of these ways that lead toward the perpetuation of cultural values from one generation to the next. This land is also ice, it's ocean, it's lakes, it's tidal zones, it's islands, it's the whole environment, because that environment encompasses areas around the Arctic Circle, remember. Side note on the petition, it's a fantastic document, and it's certainly not a normal legal petition in that both of these images actually come straight from the petition. So we see here an Inuit hunter, he's pulling a seal out of a hole in sea ice. He's literally on the Arctic Ocean here and has set a trap. I don't know the terminology in a lot of detail. He's caught a seal as part of this practice that they're describing. But in addition to a lot of information about what it means to live on the land, and especially to live on the ice, and to earn one's living that way in a way that perpetuates the most vaunted values of culture. They also bring that together with a lot of science. And so this image on the lower side of your screen, that also comes from the Petition. And this image comes from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. So in a sense, they're actually using science funded by the US government while bringing a petition against the US government. So what we're seeing here is the reduction in sea ice over this period of time from 1979 to 2003. So the procedure that this gentleman is performing in getting a livelihood through the practices that are passed down over generations, a very difficult environment, a difficult procedure, that's going to be even more difficult as this change takes place. So the second part of this kind of brief section of quotes that I have for you from the Petition: global warming, they say, harms every aspect of Inuit life and culture, and the effects of global warming constitute violations of Inuit human rights. So there's a bunch of legal analysis in there, which is going to take more time than we have this evening to walk through. But it's interesting to think about the way in which they're bringing together traditional knowledge, legal provisions, and science to make a claim. Why? Because frankly, they need to substantiate those connections that we've been talking about and trace responsibility through those connections to achieve the kinds of redress and protection that they need for the perpetuation of their culture. So that's kind of the purpose and the logic of the Petition. So the next chapter that's still in this section on international laws and institutions looks at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So one of the goals that I have tonight in walking through these chapters for you is to really flesh out a little bit of the sense of these relational registers, relational domains, and the forms of connection that I'm interested in, and how those are wrapped up in understanding climate injustice. And in a mirror to that, how folks that have been working to achieve climate justice, whether that's for Inuit people, people of color in the US, whatever constituency, how that work is also about substantiating connections. So moving then to look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for a few minutes, or what those in the know call the UNFCCC. Okay, so here's an image from the Copenhagen meeting in 2009 of the UNFCCC. But let's get a little bit of background here. What is this thing? It's important, especially for Americans, to really grapple with, in my view, what the UN is about and what these different organs within the UN are about, right? So here's an image from the meeting out of which the UNFCCC was born. This is the what's usually called the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So the long name of it is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So at that time, the country representatives decided to produce this UNFCCC, this Convention on Climate Change. It's a purpose-built international treaty. That's why it's called a convention, to address climate change. It originated at that Earth Summit, and it has a pretty simple goal. The goal is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Okay, so we can probably all recognize that that's kind of what we've been on about at least since 1992, right? How does it work? What is the structure that underpins the UNFCCC? We've got a negotiation process. So sometimes I call these, you might hear these called the climate negotiations. When the UNFCCC meets, at least at the end of the year in the big formal meeting, it's called the climate negotiations. And so country parties are negotiating with each other. There's a consensus process actually at work. It's not a democracy. It's not countries voting. It's countries agreeing and signing on to agreements. And the principle is supposed to be one of consensus. And we've got civil society observers who are meant to help advise and to also speak about effects such as those that the Inuit Circumpolar Council was trying to talk about in their petition, because they are actually a civil society group. They're one of the civil society observers to the Climate Convention. So you might think about the UNFCCC as being an institution that tries to deal with some of the kind of classic problems that you encounter when thinking about environment and development, when thinking about human users of resources, but at the global scale. So here's a few images that just kind of refer to some of those tropes or structures that we use to think about these problems. The first one here is the tragedy of the commons, which you're likely familiar with, but at the Earth scale. The second one is the prisoner's dilemma. And here's just a quick pin from an article looking at climate change and the problem of how to address it using the tools of game theory, which are linked together with these framing devices, things like the tragedy of commons, things like the prisoner's dilemma. And this one, in fact, this little image of a prisoner's dilemma is one that is meant to reference climate change. So we've got institution 1 and institution 2. If we're thinking about the UNFCCC, these might be different countries. Well, if you're familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, you know that the different actors, the different individuals in the prisoner's dilemma have a choice, and their choice is often framed in terms of like cooperate or not, cooperate or defect, right? So here, if you want to think about the climate change context, we can think about the two choices as being limit CO2 emissions or not take any effort. No effort. And so you can see how the outcomes break down for these different actors based on how they choose these different actions, right? If they don't take any effort, well, there's a pretty severe penalty down here in the lower right-hand corner in terms of emissions and the consequences of those emissions. If they both take some effort to limit CO2 emissions, you know, there's some effort involved. So there's a little bit of a detriment, right? These are kind of like their economic accounts probably, right? So they both gave something up, but in the end, the outcome is a lot better. We've got a -2 versus a -18, right? But we've also got the problem, which is the classic one described by the prisoner's dilemma, where if one of the institutions limits CO2 and the other doesn't, then the outcome is really uneven here. So we've got still a pretty bad outcome overall, but it's clearly better for one of the institutions than the other. So institution 1 takes no effort, doesn't cost them anything. Institution 2 makes some effort, it costs them 10, right? So the climate change negotiations, the climate change conventions, you know, in a sense, they provide a framing for the global climate change problem that has some real resemblances to these game theoretical constructs. Climate change is more complex than prisoners' dilemmas and tragedy of the commons, but there are a lot of ways in which it actually does resemble those problems when we think about solving it at the international level. But there's more problems, right? Because we already saw earlier on the ways in which, as I put it, emissions correlate with social power and emissions are connected with development. So here's a quick graph that tries to capture that. I didn't produce this. This is coming from an article, and it's one of those that are publicly available for reuse with citation. So what we're seeing here is the ways in which countries' emissions are extremely directly correlated with the Human Development Index when we look at this is a logarithmic scale over here. So we're seeing the rise in emissions go right along with the rise in development for these different countries. So what does that mean for the UNFCCC and its attempts to solve the climate change problem, perhaps to solve climate injustice through this framework? It means it's quite difficult because we've got power imbalances that go along with this figure, right? The US, Japan, let's see, we're at the top over here. Here we've got China, Brazil. Imagine how many delegates you can send to negotiate at the climate negotiations if you are of the development status of the United States. Imagine how many delegates you can send and the kinds of training and expertise they can access if you're Nigeria or you're Bangladesh and you're down here on the development index. So the negotiations are subject to vast power imbalances, but they're also subject to those north-south conflict dynamics that I tried to capture with that contrast in those two cartograms earlier on. And of course, we've got each country pursuing its own national interest. That's kind of what they do at international negotiations. It's pretty hard to get out of that. That's where the prisoner's dilemma kind of does reflect a lot of what we see. And we've got the consensus process. So what that means is that high emitters can't be forced to make or honor commitments to mitigate. So here's a quote from an interview that I did with a former climate negotiator when I was doing the research that eventually became part of this book. And this guy was generous enough to talk to me over lunch for a long time. He now works for, does not work as a climate negotiator anymore. So he says, "Can you name a case where on anything of significant economic import, the way we do things in the US came about as a result of an international agreement?" Kind of putting me on the spot. "I can think of multiple," he says, "where it worked the other way. We took action 9 years before the Montreal Protocol. The Endangered Species Act preceded the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. We took action as a result of our national dynamics. For the US," he says, "but I think also for China and many other countries, the river flows domestic to international." So these are some of the obstacles to achieving climate justice at the UNFCCC. But we've got other problems too, because we now have a format of agreement, the Paris Agreement, that allows countries to commit to reduce their emissions on their own, of their own volition. There are nearly every country on the globe, now that we're rejoining it, will do some work, will detriment our account in that prisoner's dilemma by some factor to reduce our emissions. But those emissions and their reductions are no longer tied to a scientific accounting, nor are they negotiated under the Paris Agreement. So what we're looking at in this graph, this kind of beautiful graph here, is that we're getting closer and closer to a precipice where instead of reducing our emissions, we're gonna have to be pulling emissions out of the atmosphere, right, in order to avert the worst outcomes of anthropogenic climate change. The longer we wait, as we move along the horizontal axis here, the steeper we need to reduce our emissions in order to get to the safe zone that science is telling us we need to be in, this 1.5 degree Celsius rise. So a troublesome environment in which to try to address the climate change problem and the climate injustice problem. It's still important to participate in the UNFCCC, and that's maybe a separate conversation that we can get at if people want to. But the point here is that we do need to address national level dynamics, and we need to figure out how to get past that prisoner's dilemma framing if we can. So that, in part, is some of the work that climate justice organizers and organizations have been doing over the past now really 2 decades plus. The first really major civil society meeting that was framed in terms of climate justice was in 1999. And some of those meetings have looked a bit like this. These are images that I took in traveling to to observe UNFCCC meetings and then realizing that there was a whole set of meetings and activity going on outside simultaneous with those meetings. So when we think about the climate justice movement, particularly at the global level, these are often the kinds of settings and the kinds of activities that might come to mind if you're familiar with the movement as a whole. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what's in the 4th chapter in the book here, which is looking at these venues outside, sometimes right outside the UNFCCC meetings, and the ways in which those deploy certain kinds of connective strategies to develop a politics of climate justice and to push on negotiators inside the rooms, inside the negotiations, but also to develop alternatives that can live outside them. So here's a quote from an organizer in one of these outside venues in Durban, South Africa in 2011. So he says, "Our climate justice movement is not separate from other justice movements out there. The CJ movement is an economic justice movement. It's a social justice movement. It's a political justice movement. Climate brings all of our movements together, and we're building and developing. That's why we have these civil society spaces. Here, the job of our movements is to build, connect, and make relationships." So the images that on this page are kind of referring to some of these types of connections, and I'll unpack 1 or 2 of them here. This is a picture that I took at a municipal park in Cancun, in Mexico, in 2010, when the climate negotiations were being hosted at a fancy hotel just south of the city. So this is the kind of outside venue that organizer is talking about. If you can read the signs on your screen, where the main sign behind these speakers says La Via Campesina. So the organization, one of the main organizations that's hosting this meeting. But this is literally a band shell in a municipal park. Outside the frame of this image, and I wish it was in it, they had a plywood structure set up with different booths in which translators sat talking into microphones, and they had a low-level radio transmitter so that they could translate the speeches of each of the people who took the stage into 4 or 5 different languages. And people on the stage spoke in Spanish, in English, in French, in German, in Greek, and perhaps other languages. So this was part of the connections being built in Cancun during this outside gathering. These people, most of them can't go into the negotiations because you have to have a special accreditation granted by an observer organization or a country party to go into the negotiations. So the organizer in Durban continues. The conversations, the meetings that happen are about building from the ground up, whether it's local campaigns against extractives or looking at transformations in food and agriculture and in energy. It's looking at what the solutions are. Our policies and positions come from real positions, from our communities, from real experiences. We formulate those and we bring them into the UNFCCC space. So what he's referring to there is that some of the organizations involved in organizing meetings like this also do have accreditation. So some individuals can move between those two types of spaces and further knit together those different spaces through the exchange of knowledge, but also through this process of bringing voice from outside communities into the negotiations. Usually that's as a civil society observer, so not a country party, except in some pretty rare exceptions. So one of the, this image here I'm including to capture one of these ideas that this organizer is referring to. He says, our positions and policies come from real positions from our communities, the real experiences. We formulate those and bring them into the UNFCCC spaces. So one of the ideas that came out of and gestated in those kinds of conversations was the idea of climate debt. This is an image framed in terms of eco-debt, but it captures the same basic idea. The idea that instead of economic debt, debt for global development, which since the middle of the 20th century in particular has been racked up by the global South borrowing from the global North to develop. If we think about environmental debt, eco-debt, or climate debt, suddenly the Earth is a little bit upside down, because these countries in the global North have contributed far more to the climate change problem than the countries in the global South. So one answer to the climate crisis is actually we're looking at a question of eco-debt. This is an image capturing another activity outside. Obviously, this is a march in the street. This is also in Durban, South Africa. And these are women who, most of the group here are from the Rural Women's Association, which drew together individuals from communities across Southern Africa to come and participate in venues, kind of like this one, and then to demonstrate in the streets. And some of them also had accreditation to go in and speak in negotiation for brief periods of time. So this is kind of a look at some of the activity, some of the connective activity, I would say, outside of the climate negotiations that has given rise to a global movement for climate justice. That can seem pretty distant for some of us. It can seem uncomfortable for some of us, but it can also seem really generative of ideas that we might want to deploy. So what does that look like when we start to think about the problems of climate injustice and the movement for climate justice in the US or even closer to home? So that's what I look at in the 5th chapter. It's kind of the last of the case study chapters in the book. And so that's called Grounding Climate Justice. It's got 2 cases in there. One of the cases that I look at is the effort by the NAACP through their environmental and climate justice program. So how do they take the existing infrastructure and the ideas that are at the core of the NAACP and the work that it's done since the beginning of the early 20th century, and marry that up with the challenge of climate injustice to produce a climate justice movement that might resonate with people in the US? That's kind of my interest in a lot of this work on grounding climate justice. So as this is just a capture from their splash page, and it's old now, so they probably have an updated image here. But this framing largely hasn't changed. What they're interested in is framing climate change in relationship to the positions and the strengths of the NAACP. So they write, global climate change has a disproportionate impact on communities of color in the US and around the world. The NAACP's Environmental and Climate Justice Program was created to educate and mobilize communities to address this human and civil rights issue. So climate change as a civil rights issue is part of the work the intellectual work that's being done in the service of building a movement around climate justice in the US for constituencies in the US. I interviewed one of the leaders of this group, and she narrated for me some of this work and how she went about it. She says, when I did the Climate Justice 101 training, people said, I thought this was going to be about climate and workplace discrimination. But on the other end, meaning after the training, it was, wow, we really get how this connects to everything. So this connective work is what she does, or a big part of what she does. Connections between everything from the drivers of climate change to coal-fired power plants to other greenhouse gas emitting facilities to how this affects us on the other side with Hurricane Katrina. So here she describes these different moments in the fossil fuel economy and its climate change results, right? So from the production of power to the impacts in terms of intensifying storms in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance. She goes on, agricultural yield and the lack of affordable foods, even criminal justice. Half our kids have asthma and half have ADHD, both of which are affected by toxins in the air. 70% of us live in places in violation of air pollution standards, and we wonder why so many of us are incarcerated. If you're not reading at grade level by grade 3, you're more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system. So these are the things that people see every day, but they don't necessarily make those ties. So this is the kind of work that goes into the politics of connection, the kind of bringing together of the nature and society factors and processes that we don't always see as connected, but that help us to grasp the ways in which we're affected by climate change. Here's a few of the artifacts of work that they've produced. These both, again, come from the NAACP, communicating this kind of analysis, this kind of connective analysis for policymakers and constituents. So on the lower left here, this was a collection of interviews, testimonials with women who live in communities, front fence line communities outside of coal-fired power plants, talking about the effects of those plants and also, in some cases, efforts to shut them down. And then we have a report. This one was also co-authored by the Indigenous Environmental Network and El Vejo, the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization in Chicago. This report is called Cold-Blooded. And what it does is evaluate all of the existing coal power plants at that period in terms of an environmental justice score, and looks at the different companies that run those plants and some of the different conditions in communities. Some communities rely on those plants economically, some don't. Some plants are dirtier than others, right? So this is the kind of analytical work that also goes into building up an analysis and a constituency for climate and environmental justice in the US. And finally, here's an image of a meeting, and I neglected to include the caption here. I believe this is a meeting that the NAACP brought together with representatives from historically Black colleges and universities after the BP oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, if I remember correctly. So one of the things that's really fascinating about what the NAACP can do as a pre-existing organization with all of this expertise and this apparatus for voter registration, voter turnout, and its relationship with the legal arm, which is semi-separate at this point from the NAACP. They have all these connections with law expertise, with civil society organizations, and an apparatus for policy advocacy. So marrying that up, that infrastructure, if you will, up with the analysis of climate justice is one of those forms of connection to supersede those kinds of governmental disconnections that are often leaving communities without recourse and without voice in processes that are affecting their socio-environmental realities. And this image is just to capture, in the briefest of terms, the second case that's in that particular chapter of the book. This chapter, after looking at the NAACP, looks at the Cowboy Indian Alliance, or what's sometimes called the New Cowboy Indian Alliance, which is an effort to prevent the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline across the middle of the country, an effort that has claimed a number of successes at this point. And this is the group which brings together ranchers and farmers and indigenous peoples who live in the heartland of the US and bringing them together around opposition to KXL. So not always framed in terms of climate per se, but an example of the kind of alliances that develop out of, in this case, the spiritual and livelihood and familial connections with the same land, despite the bloody history on that land that has divided these groups. So here's another example of a kind of politics of connection, if you will, that I'm analyzing in the book. And really, for the purposes of highlighting the kind of potential of alliances to be built around the idea of climate, being that it is so connected with so many aspects of people's lives, and also the potential for a new form of environmentalism, frankly, that might bring together constituencies as diverse, as different, and as historically opposed as these two. So those are the chapters, and I'm going to kind of catch up a little bit with, material since the research that I did with that book just briefly. So hopefully you're recognizing a few of these images, or you have something to hang them on, right? In the upper left, of course, Greta Thunberg, who's now working on COVID-related global inequalities, but who started the school strike for climate. In the middle here, an image from an Extinction Rebellion protest, obviously pre-pandemic. Down here on the lower left, members of the Sunrise Movement who have advocated for the Green New Deal and other policy provisions in the US that capture some of the core ideas that I think you can see emerging from the climate justice movement. They don't always use the term climate justice. Some of these groups do, some of them don't. This image on the upper right, the source, I forget, it comes from a discussion of the idea of just transition. Just transition being a way of bringing affected communities as well as those who are working in the fossil fuel industry along in the necessary energy transition that we have to go through. And down here, a march, which is also being framed in terms of just transition. Black Mesa to Richmond, just transition, right? So Black Mesa in Arizona, and looking at the ways in which the idea of just transition is bringing together the environmental need to transition away from fossil fuels, as well as the economic and the livelihood and the cultural needs of communities who live near power plants, who work in power plants, who mine coal, who are affected in any number of different ways by their own relationship, their embodied relationship with the fossil fuel economy, to come along in a transition that will be more just, one hopes. So these, I hope, are somewhat familiar to many of you. I want to leave you with a few different, even closer to home examples connected with climate justice in some ways, certainly connected with the just transition idea. It so happens that as I'm delivering this talk, I'm anticipating next week's lobby day and week of action by the Illinois Environmental Council. So if you live in Springfield and if you've been participating in or following environmental politics for a while, you probably know about IEC. And their lobby day. So this year, the entire lobby day is the lobby day, I should say, has been expanded to a week of action, and it's been structured around environmental justice. And so there's a number of different activities that you can participate in, depending on the level of engagement you want to have, depending on how much time you have, and depending on your interest. So I'm going to try to see if I can easily switch over to this screen real quick. Can I do that? I think I'm going to need to. Yeah, okay. So here is the splash page for the Environmental Justice Lobby Day and Week of Action. If you're interested in getting involved locally, the opportunity is here. So register there. It's just a form. It's very easy to do. There's a variety of different activities that you can do. Most of those are described here. So for example, there's a Lobby Day Environmental Justice Rally remote on Monday. And then there are activities for every day of the week. Most of them have to do with advocating policy positions through your legislators, through your elected representatives. What else do I want to show you on this? Yeah, this, we've got, so here's just a flyer for the Environmental Justice Rally Day on Monday, noon to 12:30, online. Not a huge lift, maybe a little bit more effort if you want to call your one of your representatives. A lot of this is being framed around CEJA. CEJA, if you haven't encountered it before, is the Clean Energy Jobs Act. It's a bill working its way through the legislature right now in Illinois. Arguably, it's a great representative of a just transition bill. And so here we have an invitation to a virtual town hall on Thursday, so it's a week from right now, looking at CEJA and particularly what's being called the equity provisions in CEJA, which pertain to environmental justice and climate justice, frankly, in as much as we're talking about transitioning from one energy source to another, which is the idea in CEJA. So those are opportunities at your doorstep. I hope you'll consider participating in those. And that's what I've got for you. I'm pretty close to an hour here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. And I'd be happy to field any questions or chat and hang out for a while if you'd like to.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, the chat is open, or if you raise your hand. I think you can also unmute yourselves.
Yeah, it looks like it. I'll see if I can open up the chat. Thank you, Raven. Okay, yeah, I can read. Shall I read from the chat then? I have a question here. It says, what is your opinion about individuals or organizations who claim to be working toward climate/social justice, but are really looking to further their own needs, or who choose which, quote, projects will receive focus instead of engaging the community? It's a great question. I think it's a tricky and kind of classic question of forming political coalitions, right? In a sense, what politics is about is bringing interest groups together, right? So at a certain level, organizations who participate are probably nearly always going to be looking to further their own needs. And one might argue that that's all fair game. In fact, that would be the main purpose of politics, right? On the other hand, as the questioner is suggesting, how do we negotiate these different needs together, right? If we want to build a coalition. And then to kind of think about the second half of this, it says, really looking to forward their own needs, further their own needs, or who choose which projects will receive focus instead of engaging the community. I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of the fundamental challenge that's always before organizers and people who want to mobilize. So you either have institutional power, in which case you don't really need to worry about whether the decisions that you make or the interests that you have align with those of others or not, or you don't have that power, and so you're organizing to build that power, and that necessarily involves the kind of negotiation. And when I say negotiation, I mean the kind of process that you're talking about. So I think those are good questions. People who participate, people who I've met who participate actively in organizing are actually often thinking about these questions as well. And no one is perfect, and they're aware of that. But that these are live conversations to be had as groups seek to develop a shared position. And in the book, there is a section in there which I didn't talk about this evening, which has to do with some of those outside venues around the UNFCCC meetings, where coming to agreement and getting on the same page is not at all straightforward, and where even the kind of position that might go on a banner or go in a chant in a march, it's hard to get there and to get everyone on the same page. Because people have different needs as well, right? So finding those shared needs and building that solidarity, I mean, that's the real challenge of something like climate justice, I think. So thanks for that question. I know that some of my students are on here, and some of them may have questions for me, or may want to add to the picture themselves in terms of what they've seen in terms of environmental or climate policy and politics over the last several years. And I'm also interested if anyone is already planning to attend any of the activities next week that the Illinois Environmental Council is planning. We could think of those as an example, to take Maricella's question further, of kind of needing to arrive at a coalitional statement. So in this case, because of where we're at with the legislative process, CEJA is the focus of activity for a lot of groups, and the Illinois Environmental Council actually brings together a lot of different groups. So right now, I think locally, it might be a relatively easier time to do that coalitional work than some situations, some places and times are.
Hi, this is Rachel. I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
This is all kind of somewhat new for me. So I'm wondering, in terms of, like, I know recently I've seen, I mean, social media obviously is playing a huge role in like just as consumers and, just community people on that level of being aware of things that are happening in the world. And I've recently been hearing a lot about Japan dumping like nuclear waste from, I can't remember, but they're like going to dump it in the ocean. And I'm just wondering, like, is it the UNFCCC? Like, I know there's obviously going to be limitations in what they can do, but can they just say like no to those things? Or I'm just wondering, like, what do they do in those kind of situations? Like,
that's a great question, and it's worth spending some time on too, because it's we sometimes get a message that the UN is some kind of global government that's gonna I don't know, take away steak or something like that. I mean, you get these kind of messages periodically, and so the UN is kind of interesting in that it's not a government. It's an intergovernmental kind of conversation, and so a lot has come out of that becomes programs that are implemented in different places. But there's not, when we do kind of policy studies and we think about environmental compliance in the US, for example, we're often thinking about what are called carrots and sticks, right? Carrots are, if you're going to recycle, maybe you'll get some kind of tax break. You get a carrot. A stick is, if you don't recycle, you get a fine, right? So the UN doesn't really have sticks and carrots of its own. The member countries can exert those, but frankly, a lot of them don't like to. So there's kind of a gray area in a sense in terms of political power and the way that operates between countries through the UN. It's, I think, a good analogy to the way in which the UN exerts power. Well, maybe two. One is the idea of the bully pulpit of the presidency in the United States, right? If you're the president, you get to frame the conversation. You get to keep things on the agenda by talking about them because there's a lot of media following you around all the time, right? So in a sense, the UN has some of that kind of influence, but it also has a kind of supportive role that it plays. And that's a lot more visible in developing countries. It's not really that visible in the US because, again, the UN kind of exists to help to, let's say, mediate global problems. And so often the more developed countries are contributing more resources to address those problems than developing countries are. And so you might have expertise and toolkits kind of rolling out so that countries in the global south can develop environmental protection laws, for example, that are going to serve their population. And that's being rolled out through some like UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, would do that kind of work. So it's really quite limited what the UN can do to kind of force a country to stop doing something that maybe it should stop doing. That's kind of the short answer there. Yeah.
Where do you see the future of policies and things going?
That's a great question. I think that this just transition idea is kind of the idea right now. And it makes a lot of sense. In a sense, I feel like it's the natural place we get to. You can kind of think of, for example, former President Trump having coal miners in the Oval Office as he signed an executive order to promote coal, right? You can think of the Yellow Vest movement in France in fall of 2018, where regular people all over the country start to protest because there's a gas tax, right? So my suspicion is that if we're going to transition off of fossil fuels, we have to have a pretty robust way of dealing with the kinds of inequalities and precarious livelihoods that already exist in the world, right? So that's kind of potentially one of the really most potent kind of problems with addressing the climate crisis, is that we have deep inequality and a lack of kind of social infrastructure to help people as they maybe lose their job in a coal mine, for example. So that's, I think, where a program like it's not really a program, a concept like the Green New Deal and some of the Biden administration's discussion about infrastructure kind of falls into a similar kind of category there. So I kind of think that's where we're at, is realizing like it's not that easy to just tell people to stop burning fossil fuels and kind of let the axe fall on industries that employ communities and fund their soccer teams and their schools and all that stuff, that we actually have to do this other more complicated work. I'm seeing another question in here. It says, what is your opinion on possible quotas on emissions? A certain country can only emit X amount or will have to pay a fine, and how effective are those? So I think that in a sense, this is pretty related to Rachel's question about, what can the UN do to prevent, dumping of waste in the oceans or something like that. So prior to the Paris Agreement, we had what was called the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first really major agreement that the UNFCCC produced, and it looked more like what Megan is describing in the chat right now, where we've got quotas on emissions. A certain country can only emit X amount, because it would pay a fine, though, because again, we don't have those sticks at that international level. We have countries have sovereignty that kind of is respected in international law, which means that they can't really force each other to do things. That's where kind of, not without something like warfare, right, or sanctions, right? So you could have a situation where you could have international sanctions related to economic sanctions related to emissions. We're not there yet, but I think that frankly is possible. Maybe in my daughter's lifetime. I'm not sure it's possible in my lifetime, but I think it could be on the horizon. So in terms of how effective they are, this question of sovereignty, which kind of goes back again to that the kind of prisoner's dilemma kind of analogy for something like a global negotiation, it's a challenge, and so if there were a way that to sanction nations or corporations or individuals, whomever, for their emissions, that could fit within the international system that we have, I think it would be effective. I think we probably will eventually get there, but I think it might be a while. I've never thought about that one before, so it's a good, thank you for that question. Well, maybe folks are getting hungry.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Brandon, for such an informative presentation. There's a lot to think about. And thank you for presenting that information for next week, especially locally within Springfield and Illinois. That was going to be one of my questions, was that, what could we do as an individual on a community basis? So thanks. If anyone else doesn't have anything to say, just thank you, Brandon. That was really, really informative and very important. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. We have a lot of online programs. If you want to go to lincolnlibrary.info, you can go ahead and look at our calendar and see everything that's coming up. We have summer reading coming up, so we have a lot of fun stuff that we're excited to present to you guys and to do. But yeah, thanks everyone so much.
Thanks everybody. And Maricela, I'm seeing your quote or your question here, so I will get back to you on that. Thanks a lot.
Everyone have a great night.
Thank you.